Hi, and welcome back to CISPA TLDR, the cybersecurity podcast of the CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security. Each month, we're inviting our researchers to give you an idea of what issues of cybersecurity in AI CISPA is currently working on. We try to stay out of confusing, in-depth tech talk, so you'll be able to follow even if you don't have a degree in computer science. The good thing is, I don't have one either. My name is Tobias Ebelshäuser, and I'm from CISPA's Communications Department. I'm excited to welcome two guests today, Divyanshu Bhardwaj and Carolyn Guthoff. They are both doctoral researchers in the research group of faculty Katharina Krompholz. Hi, and thanks for joining me, you two.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
So you are both working in usable security, and you're focusing on the human side of cybersecurity, so to say. What was it that specifically fascinated you about this area?
The human aspect of things. Computer science can quite often be just very technical and computer related. And with usable security, you do have a human aspect to everything you do. And that was something that drew me into it.
Yeah, for me, it was more like understanding this complex interplay of humans, but, also around them would be technology, culture, ethics, society, and trying to put the human in between all of this and, kind of focus on that as well. Because sometimes it's easier to forget that the human is also in the loop.
So did you already know that when you started working on computer science topics, or was it something that just came up during your studies?
Actually not. So when I did my bachelor's, this was not something that I focused on. But during my master's, one of my main focuses was human-computer interaction, where we looked at how humans and computers interact. And naturally, then I also looked at how privacy and security could influence humans and, think about the human side of it as well. So that's how I came to working here.
Okay. So both of you have recently published a paper, which has been accepted at the Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems, CHI for short. So congratulations first.
Thank you.
For this paper, you have actually delved into a really serious topic, and that is why I want to add a content warning at this point for our listeners. Your paper includes mention of child sexual abuse material, what is legally referred to as child pornography. You have conducted an interview study with experts on client-side scanning and how that could help protect children from sexual abuse. In the last episode, which was recorded in German by my colleague Annabelle, she spoke to your fellow PhD candidate Florian Handke about server-side scanning. So for starters, what is client-side scanning as opposed to server-side scanning, and how do the two go together?
What Florian did and talked about in the last podcast is how you can do research while scanning servers, which is not often done because you don't know how scanning those servers from outside can influence what is happening on the server. Whereas the client-side scanning we're talking about is how you can scan end-user devices for specific material to see whether that material is on there. There's also a server-side scanning related to that where you scan servers for specific content. However, that is done on the server with knowledge of the people using those servers, running those servers. And the server-side scanning that Florian talked about in the last episode is usually not known by those people.
Okay, so end-user devices in this case would be smartphones, computers?
Yes, for example, any client device that you could have.
Okay, so the main difference being that anything that stays on my device will be scanned in client-side scanning, and in server-side scanning only the things that are actually sent somewhere will be scanned.
Yes, if we're talking about kind of our server-side scanning, yes. That kind of goes into the direction of how client-side scanning came to be. If you're sending a message to someone and that message is not encrypted, so it's in plain text, someone looking on that server could potentially read that message, right? However, if it's encrypted, they cannot. And so with server-side scanning, what would happen is if it's not encrypted, they can check what the message contains. So they could check if it contains child sexual abuse material, for example, or a short CSAM, or whatever else. You could check for whatever. There's no specific boundary on what you can check against. But if it's encrypted, you can't do that anymore. And this is also how client-side scanning came to be, kind of. That people were like, okay, if we have end-to-end encrypted messaging, which is happening, for example, if you use Signal, if you use WhatsApp, then your messaging is encrypted.
So it's getting more widespread, and basically the most popular messaging services actually employ end-to-end encryption today?
Yes, exactly. In order to still scan messages that are in transit encrypted, people came up with this idea of, okay, if we can't scan messages on the server anymore, we will do it locally on end user devices as an idea. And this is kind of what we looked into.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to add to that a little bit, in general, if you look at it, end-to-end encryption is kind of a good thing because no one has access to, or in theory has no access to what you're sending to other people. But then it also brings with it its challenges. Then perpetrators or malicious actors also get the advantage of that and can send around stuff without anyone being able to check on that.
So it makes it more difficult for law enforcement agencies to...
Yes.
Exactly. And that's why law enforcement has been pressing for more comprehensive access to end-to-end encrypted stuff, such that they are able to collect evidence and prohibit possible crimes.
And that is why also the client-side scanning came up as a possible solution to circumvent end-to-end encryption.
Exactly.
There's a lot of talk going on about like how to circumvent this end-to-end encryption in law enforcement. But the notion of putting a backdoor into end encryption, that's a very bad idea, because then you essentially break the algorithms that do the encryption. So client-side scanning was thought of as a way to kind of keep that notion of having end-to-end encryption without a backdoor, while still being able to have a way to somehow scan the content that is sent around.
Okay. Taking a step back, how did you come to work on this topic, and how did you actually choose this, let's say, very serious scope that you were focusing on in your paper?
So when I joined my PhD, this was one of the topics that I started with. It was also because the timeline really fit, because in August of 2021, Apple proposed this kind of a client-side scanning-based solution or they planned to do it for the iPhones. And I started my PhD in October, so there was, this hot topic period where everyone was talking about it, and there was a raging debate whether this is a good idea or not. And at some point, Carolyn was looking into emergencies.
I was looking into emergencies with children online, or I had this idea to work on it somehow. And I think that's how you approached me. And then we kind of started working on it together, and also figured out that the way people were talking about client-side scanning was very dependent on their understanding of the technology. But there was no one size fits all definition of client-side scanning. So there was, I think, in an assessment of a legislative proposal from the EU, there were some mention of client-side scanning, but all of them kind of had it was not one comprehensive definition that included everything that people mentioned around client-side scanning. And so we were well, we think there needs to be one definition of client-side scanning, or there needs to be one something around client-side scanning that kind of draws the boundaries of it, of what people can understand about it. And that's also something that we then wanted to cover with our interviews and our study.
Okay, then maybe let's get into more detail with your paper. So your paper is titled Mental Models, Expectations and Implications of Client-Side Scanning. What exactly are mental models, and what did your study try to achieve in detail?
On a very high level, mental models are the way we explain the world around ourselves to us in our head. So if I ask you to describe a chair for me, that's probably very easy for you, because you know what a chair looks like. You sit on one every day. If I ask you to describe a bicycle, that's probably going to be harder. And if I ask you to describe something in a computer, like how the internet works, how HTTPS works, how client-side scanning works, that's all very, very abstract. Yeah. So it's very easy to have very different understandings of these things. And with building these mental models, we try to get an understanding of how people explain technological things to themselves.
A real world example would be, when the recycle bin came up, it's always shown as a trash bin, and then when you delete something, your trash bin gets full, so you kind of take that as a real world mental model, because you know that a trash bin is something where you throw stuff in.
Okay. Okay, so when you're saying like trying to explain these abstract things to yourselves, does that also apply to experts? So do also experts that work with these things, do they also have different mental models of what they're actually working on? Like when it comes to client-side scanning?
Not necessarily. So we found that the better the technical understanding of the experts we talked to was, the better, like the more nuanced their mental model was and the more wholesome it was. Mm-hmm. However, I mean, experts in terms of client-side scanning, so the experts that we interviewed didn't all have a technical background, because we talked to people from academia, both computer science and law, but we also talked with people who worked in child protection, prosecution, so people who do not necessarily have a technical background. Mm-hmm. And some of them did actually have extensive technological knowledge about it, and we were like blown away by their by their technical understanding of it. But for others, it was like more of like, okay, we have this client-side scanning and it sounds like an amazing solution, but someone else has to figure out how to make it work. I just think it's a good solution. Like it's a good idea.
Just in theory, it's a good idea. It could work, but I have no idea how.
Yes, exactly. And so we had kind of a little bit of everything on the spectrum, from like, I understand it like perfectly to, I think it's a good idea, but I don't know how you can technically do that. And so we then took all of these understandings that we received through our interviews and we put them into what you could call an aggregated mental model, where we kind of compiled everything. And then we took this and said, okay, for a few things, you can have dimensions, where you can have dimensions in a sense that there's different things that you can pick, and then you can like build a different version of client-side scanning.
Okay. So there's just not only one solution, there could be tons of different ways to actually build this.
So you kind of, with client-side scanning, you kind of start with a goal. So in the CSAM context, that goal could be to search for CSAM. Mm-hmm. And then you have several different client-side scanning systems that you can build from that. So one very simple thing is that you could use a machine learning algorithm to search for content. You could use a hashing algorithm to search for content. And then within those hashing algorithms, you could either use cryptographic hashing algorithms. That basically means that whatever you're looking for, one-on-one has to be the exact same thing that you will find.
Mm-hmm. So it would only work if I have like a database of child sexual abuse material as a law enforcement agency. I can just check if exactly the same files are present on a device somewhere.
Exactly. Okay. Then there's perceptual hashing, where the picture could look slightly different. So it could be cropped, it could be turned. But that's already where the problem starts, because if you don't have cryptographic hashing anymore, so if I look for a blue apple and the cryptographic hashing algorithm says, okay, I found a blue apple, then the probability of that actually being a blue apple is 100%. But with a perceptual hashing algorithm, if that looks for a blue apple, the probability is not at 100% anymore. So if it tells me it found a blue apple, it could also have found a red apple.
Okay. And then we will also get into the risks of such a possible client-side scanning.
Exactly.
But before we get into that, I want to know what experts you were actually talking to. You said you had like a very broad field of people with different backgrounds, different like knowledge bases when it comes to client-side scanning and CSAM. How did you choose them? And how did you approach these people?
I think at the start, a lot of it was targeted to what we could find from people, especially blog posts or stuff. Also, for example, on Twitter, where people were active and talking about, client-side scanning at the time. And then one of our main goals was to try and be as diverse as possible while recruiting, so that we don't just have the opinion of one particular demographic, but, have more like a holistic overview on all of this. We tried to... So it was sending out a lot of emails.
A lot of emails.
So you just wanted to avoid to have like just the opinion of, I don't know, cybersecurity researchers, because I think cybersecurity researchers might have a fairly different opinion on just the whole act of client-side scanning as someone working in law enforcement might have.
Yes, definitely. Also, what I feel is that people with a cybersecurity background are very privacy conscious, and that's very important, but that's only one side of the story when it comes to client-side scanning. So yeah, we did talk to cybersecurity experts. We talked to prosecutors. We talked to people from child protection who actually work with cases. We talked to digital rights advocates, even though, I mean, we do have the cybersecurity perspective, but digital rights is something else again. So we also had that perspective in there. We also talked to data protection experts, which was very interesting.
Okay, that's probably a tough question to answer because I'm sure these answers will have varied very wildly, but what do experts think? Do they think that client-side scanning could be an effective way to combat CSAM, or I mean, even any other illegal dealings, right? So if we talk about drug trafficking, organized crime, terrorism, it's always security-related topics that will be targeted by something like this.
I think, yeah, when you say that, it's also like super important to keep in mind that these topics are very emotionally laden, right? So it's easy to, try and come up with something to tackle these problems just because they are such important problems and need to be taken care of. And so, for example, if now someone says that client-side scanning is a way of protecting children from CSAM, and if you go out and say, no, that's not a good idea, then that should put you in good light.
Yeah, sure.
So it's like very important to also keep that in mind.
So you're saying that people actually might have a different opinion, but might be like a little shy to say it because they think, okay.
Not necessarily. Yeah. I think something that summarizes what we talk to our participants with very well is this one thing that one of our participants said, and they said about client-side scanning, that it's a bad solution to a worse problem.
Okay.
Which kind of went into the direction of it's not a good idea, but you kind of do want to do something because child sexual abuse is such a bad problem. And right now it's like the best thing that people could come up with technologically to do something against that problem.
And like not doing anything can be seen as like a worse way of dealing with things than just doing something.
Yeah, so I can understand the sentiment of wanting to do anything just to tackle this incredibly serious problem. And as you already said, it's with these emotional topics, it's very hard to really judge it in a completely neutral fashion. It might even be impossible. But I mean, that is a really big challenge when you try to do like a research paper that has to be really neutral, because that is what research and science is all about. I mean, how did you go on and try to separate this idea of client-side scanning from all these negative emotions that come up with when we talk about child sexual abuse?
It was very difficult for us. Also because we as individuals have our opinions. But, when we're doing research, we can't let that bias us, especially when we are doing interview studies, for example. So we tried our best to stay level-headed, be as neutral as possible. Sometimes also our paper reads very dry because, we did not want to put any emotion into the paper. Yeah. Already it has like this emotion of the topic. So we tried our best, also came with multiple iterations of, rewording sentences, rewording questions, being very careful with what we say to experts, talking amongst ourselves multiple times, deciding on how we approach certain topics to experts. I think Carolyn can also talk a little bit more about how the interviews went.
I tried to stay very neutral during the interviews and try to not let my own opinion influence any of that. During analysis, we also try to see, okay, do we need this CSAM context for analyzing this specific part? And then, for example, we have this picture in our paper that kind of that you need a goal, which gives the context of everything that you're doing with client-side scanning. Then from this goal, you kind of have this mental model of a client-side scanning system. So whether it's a machine learning algorithm or a hashing algorithm that's used, whether something is sent to a third party or not, where something is scanned for. So if it's on an application level, if it's on the operating system level, if it's on the device level. So you have all of these different things that kind of come into play in the mental model. And going from the goal to the mental model, we were like, okay, we have to take the CSAM context out of that mental model. And we did that while analyzing. And then for the expectations and implications part, we had to put that part into the CSAM context again, because the discussion around client-side scanning concerning expectations and implications is so focused on the CSAM context that there was no way for us to decontextualize that.
So summarizing, your goal mainly was to take stock of what people actually mean when they talk about client-side scanning, because there are so many different ways to actually implement such a technique, such a system. And coming to expectations and implications, expectations basically being, what do people expect client-side scanning to do? Do they expect if that can solve the problems you are talking about?
And also, like Carolyn mentioned, specifically in the context of CSAM. So,
okay. And then coming to the implications, what would the implementation of such a system bring with it? And I think that's where we should get back to what Carolyn was hinting at before. There are quite some negative implications that could go along with it. So please tell me about that.
I think we first have to talk about the negative expectations that people had before going into implications. And maybe Divyanshu, do you want to?
Yeah.
That's your expertise.
So when we talked to experts, one of our goals was to understand what kind of expectations they had, because they're experts in their field. They know a lot about, how a certain technology would end up. And so we wanted to talk to them about certain things. For example, what happens if CSS is adopted? Will it ever be adopted, for example? And like Carolyn also mentioned, the lack of an alternative making it attractive. Experts said that there could be a possibility where it is adopted, just because there's nothing else that can be done right now, or it seems super appealing just because you want to do something and not just sit. But while some experts said that could be adopted, a lot of them were kind of against adoption of such a technology. We also did talk about how they think such a technology would be used. And one of the things was that, of course, the main goal in the CSAM context, the main goal would be to stop the dissemination of CSAM, try to protect children, hopefully stop perpetrators, identify and stop them. But I think experts were quick to point out that, client-side scanning as a technology is not limited to a domain. And so once it comes into existence, the domain can easily be expanded and, could be used or misused in whichever way the entity that controls it deems fit.
Yeah, it's always a common concern, right? With technology that is encroaching on privacy rights, that it doesn't stop at that point.
No, also with client-side scanning, you can't technologically limit what is scanned for. Like you can say, okay, I only want to scan for images, or I only want to scan for speech or behavior or whatever. But you can't technologically limit this to only CSAM or only cat pictures or only pictures of trees or whatnot. I don't know. You can't do that technologically. So you have to have policies around that. And that's very easy when we're like in the German context or in the EU context. But if you kind of go to less democratic countries, you don't necessarily have that anymore.
Right. And then it's next, might be a picture of a political demonstration or some kind of symbol of a political party.
And then you have this technology that was built to fight CSAM, but it's so easily reused for something else.
Yeah.
And then especially with that factor that client-side scanning, how it's used in discussions to fight CSAM always has this component that a report is sent out to a third-party entity, be that law enforcement or the electronic service provider or whatever. Something always leaves the person's phone.
Yeah.
And that could also be without their consent. That could even be without their knowledge.
Yeah.
And then you have that technology, and that can potentially be used in however which way.
Yeah. And that is only that is only speaking about how someone could misuse it, but even the technology might fail, right? So because as you've said before, if perceptual hashes, if they don't have like a 100% guarantee that what is on this device is CSAM material, and it sends out like a warning to law enforcement and says, okay, there might be some CSAM on this phone, and there isn't, we are also talking about potentially some big problems for the person who has like a picture that is only slightly similar to something that might be illegal.
Yeah, I mean, we also looked into what the potential challenges would be, like you say, to this client-side scanning system. And one of the main things, like you pointed out, was how would you differentiate CSAM from non-CSAM, right? Of course, you do this technically or technologically, but then there's also a lot of context involved in this, right? For example, there was this case that was brought up also by many of our participants where a person lost access to their account just because they were sending a medical image of their child to the child's doctor. Okay. And, that's not CSAM, but the system or the scanning entity thought of it as CSAM and blocked them off of their account. So, of course, there are challenges. So this is like one of the challenges, differentiating CSAM and non-CSAM. There's, of course, challenges also to, like you pointed out, the algorithms. We do know that they're not 100% foolproof. If you end up doing a CSS, you also need to have a database, and you need to protect this database. Make sure it's not infiltrated by malicious actors.
I mean, on one hand, there already is a database like that. I think the biggest one is curated by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US. And that's already used for server-side scanning. Okay. However, that kind of the scale of all of this gets so much bigger when we're not talking about servers anymore, but about clients.
Exactly. And also this goes hand in hand with what Carolyn said about, when this technology goes to, while it's fine when it's in Germany or in the EU, what happens when it's passed on to non-democratic countries, and then having a database which is not secure can lead to different problems. Could easily expand the search domain with other stuff that is not CSAM and have people targeted with that.
Getting back to our cybersecurity context at CISPA here, there might reasonably also be the possibility of poisoning this algorithm, right? To have a picture that looks to the algorithm as being CSAM or anything illegal, while it's not.
Perceptual hashing algorithms are actually broken in that way that you can trick them with sending in something that looks totally not bad, but the algorithm sees it as being bad.
Because the hash looks kind of similar.
Yeah. Or maybe if we go away from that judgment, so we have a picture that looks a certain way, and you looking at it, you would not think that the perceptual hashing algorithm would target that picture.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, the perceptual hashing algorithm actually sees a match in that.
Getting back to what you said in the beginning, Apple actually announced they wanted to implement such a client-side scanning on their iPhones. And I remember that they were met with a lot of backlash from security experts and from the general public. So what was the main criticism about that?
I mean, I think once Apple released that, people quickly realized what they were talking about and were quick to say that, no, we do not accept such things. I mean, Apple dominates the mobile space, at least in the US and the EU, I think. And people realized that this is not something that they wanted to live with. And like you rightly said, they had to meet with a lot of backlash, also from security experts and normal people. They went back and forth on it. They tried to explain how they're doing it in a good way, explain their algorithm. Also the documentation and stuff was made public so that people could read into it. But I think they realized that this was not something that they could, or this was not an easy battle that they could win. And so, in December of 2022, they decided to scrap the CSS thing, and I can quote what they said. Children can be protected without companies combing through personal data. So they realized that that's not the best way of protecting children, trying to, or perpetually scanning your stuff.
I think the privacy aspect is so big in that, even from the people that we talk to daily, privacy for us is really important. Also, I mean, through our education and our jobs now doing PhDs in the security and privacy context, we are connected to that topic every day. But also talking to my friends and my family, like for them, that's like a no-go to have something on their phones that's scanning for, like, even for this like really beneficial thing of not like sharing CSAM. But I mean, you wouldn't expect your friends or family to have CSAM on their phones, right? And then the possibility of you being targeted potentially for like a wrong match, that's like so incriminating and so bad that I definitely do not want something like that on my phone. I do think we need to do things to fight CSAM and the dissemination of it and the re-victimization of survivors. But I do not think that client-side scanning is the way to do that.
When I read your paper, there was a quote by one of the experts you were talking to. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that really time that we should stop considering technology as the ultimate solution to all of our societal problems. And it's actually something I talked to Wouter Lux, who works at CISPA, in this podcast before, that ever since technology has become so ubiquitous, our first impulse is to say, okay, let's build some technology that can help us save this, while it's actually a societal problem.
Definitely. I think that also goes with what I just said, that I do not want to have something like that on my phone, because it will not solve the problem of CSAM being generated. It will also not solve the dissemination of CSAM in the darknet, for example. And overall, just thinking that technology will solve societal problems is just a misconception. I think when I started my PhD, I remember Leah, our colleague, saying technology will not solve, technology doesn't solve problems, humans solve problems. Like, you can use technology to solve problems, but in the end, humans solve the problems.
Yeah, which also goes very well with your usable security background.
Even when a client-side scanning system comes to being, we also need to be very careful of what these implications are, because, they're far-reaching implications to society. So just having a technology, or just, labeling a technology as a means to solving this very difficult, emotionally laden, complex problem is not the right solution, at least to us.
I just remembered, I do have to add something to what I said about I do not want to have client-side scanning on my phone. And I specifically mean that I do not want to have any technology on my phone that sends something out to third parties that I'm not aware of. I do not have a 100% sure opinion about all the other aspects about client-side scanning, but I'm 100% sure that I do not want to have something on my phone that sends out things to third parties that I might not even be aware of.
At some point, it also boils down to, like you said, is it working for you, the technology, or is it working against you, right? Because client-side scanning as a technology has existed for a long time now. It's not something that we've brought out of a hat. For example, your antivirus softwares of like way old was basically client-side scanning, where, it would scan for viruses and malware. You also have photographs being grouped and scanned, spell checkers, for example, ad blockers. So client-side scanning as a technology for sure has existed since a long time. I think the added context, of CSAM and child abuse, it just has made this a much more difficult topic to, it has made it a more difficult topic to, I want to say debate, but, it's not even a debate. People are talking at crossroads, right? Everyone has, like Carolyn mentioned, has different opinions about it, and why people react so severely or react to it in an unpleasant ways because of this huge umbrella of child abuse connotation over the technology.
But all of this kind of also shows, I think, why we need to have this distinction of what type of client-side scanning we're talking about, because depending on what the client-side scanning you're talking about is, it can have so many different expectations and implications that follow from that.
And if we look at the implications of client-side scanning, the technology, but take it again in the CSAM context, there are certain, let's say now your phone has client-side scanning running, and people are being reported left, right, and center. What kind of implications would exist then? Personally, people would be always worried, scared, waiting for their phone to go off, even if they didn't do something wrong, which would kind of, like I said, make them feel confused and scared. They would also be worried about their reputation, especially if it's a false positive. You do have the reputational harm thing, and you're worried that society will now label you as a perpetrator. And those are more like implications on the personal level, but then there's also a more overarching societal implications, where society in general is worried about, what they're talking, what they're sending out in their texts, always having to self-edit and self-censor, be very careful. And this is kind of, in a way, hindering social communication, right? And of course, then there's like the implications of threats. I think we also briefly talked about it. Like once a technology like this exists, entities. So I use the word entities because anyone could, in theory, use it to, like I said, expand the domain and search for other things, not just CSAM, but also in a way target individuals or groups who hold, for example, differing opinions than these entities. And so I think it's very important to understand the implications of the technology before adopting. So understand exactly on a holistic level how much damage can be done if a technology is adopted.
Okay.
I think one of the most important things that came out of this paper for me was that even though client-side scanning, if it were to exist to fight CSAM, would be to help children, it would probably harm children the most, because it would cut into their right of privacy, it would cut into their right of free speech, it would cut into maybe other rights as well. And for example, in youth culture, you have this thing that children sometimes do share private, intimate images of themselves. And having a technology like that would immediately criminalize that, no matter what the law says. I mean, in Germany, that was illegal for a long time. That's just now changing. But you would just immediately, if a child sends something, even if they don't know what they're doing, it would immediately criminalize that. And is that really the right way to go, kind of? It's just a very complicated problem.
Yeah, I think that we can all agree on, and I think that we all can agree on that it's an important topic to talk about. It's important to find ways to combat these issues. And it's really, really important to consider all sides of technological use, if we really should be doing this before we understand what implications that could bring with it. And that is why it's good to have a paper like that. Okay, so your paper has been released already, but you haven't presented it yet because this conference that I talked about in the beginning is only coming up. Do you want to tell us about that?
Actually, our paper has not officially been released yet.
Okay.
So it will be released with the conference. So usually in computer science, or in our field of computer science, it's that we submit papers to conferences. They're then peer reviewed. And once they're accepted, hopefully, you then present them at a conference. And with that presentation at the conference, they're published.
Okay.
And so we're going to Hawaii in May to present our paper at CHI. And I always have to laugh at that part because going to Hawaii and presenting at CHI rhymes.
And I could think of worse places to present papers.
Yeah, we cannot complain about the location for sure.
So there hasn't been any reception yet to your research, or?
I mean, so we did get a fan mail.
Okay, but by who?
By also, I think, a PhD student from the Netherlands. And he just wanted to thank us for the paper that we wrote. And he said that he enjoyed reading the paper and, just wanted to congratulate us on working on such a topic. Yeah. So we're looking forward to more such fan mails.
Sure, you'll get them once it's out in the open for real. Okay. So thank you for coming here and navigating this very, very serious topic. I think it's probably the most serious one we've had on this podcast before. So thank you very much. Still, I don't want to let you go just yet. I want to leave with a little more uplifting questions, probably. So quick questions for both of you. So I'm just going to start. Do any of you use ChatGPT or other large language models? And if so, for what?
Yes, for planning trips.
So holidays?
Yes.
Okay.
ChatGPT is actually quite good at it and can give you a very detailed itinerary. So,
but do you double check that? Because it also can hallucinate some things that don't exist.
If you stand in front of an attraction and it doesn't exist, I mean, it could be worse.
Yeah, of course. I think that's super important to cross-check so that you don't end up at a random place.
Just a statue for someone that has never lived. Okay.
I usually don't use ChatGPT or LLMs. I have used it like for fun stuff usually, like, I don't know, asking questions that I don't even like. I don't know where to start with trying to figure out an answer.
Treating it as a jester, entertain me.
Yes. No, I haven't done that, but I usually don't use ChatGPT or other LLMs.
Okay. Second question. Do you feel that the rapid advancement of AI does offer more chances or more risks to society? This is the most loaded question that is in here. It's a
hard question.
Yeah, that is a very hard question, to be honest. Again, I just would say that it's very context dependent, and it heavily depends on how you train or build this AI and in what context it works and who are the stakeholders that are involved with this. Once you know that, you can then decide if it's has more risks or benefits to the society.
I think my knowledge on AI is too limited to give an educated answer on that.
Same.
Okay. Have you ever worked in the darknet or even used it for personal reasons?
I haven't.
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Quick answer.
Yeah, that's good. What research problem would both of you like to see solved during your time as usable security researchers?
If I could make a very wild wish, I think I would like to see the password and authentication problem solved, but I think we're very far away from that.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. I constantly struggle with passwords, even though there are now tons of password managers and multiple different ways of signing in. I do have to agree with Carolyn that passwords are really, if we could, in an ideal world, find a way to make them the best or make them the most usable, since we are like the usable security guys, Yeah.
Usable and secure at the same time.
Exactly. So we always have this metric going in our head, trying to balance usability and security.
Okay. So you would wish for the magical entity to just know that you are the right person to log into this website.
Yes, kind of like look into like your computer, and the computer like knows it's you, but even that can be hacked. So
yeah, that's why I said magical entity, not a
So we have to invent magic.
No, we're working on it. And the last question. Does any one of you have an IT security life hack for our listeners?
Do regular backups.
Yes. Use two-factor authentication.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
I broke my phone 2 years ago, and I was very happy that I had a backup in the cloud that I could immediately pull onto the second phone.
Yeah.
But
Same would apply if it was hacked or stolen, right? So.
Yeah, even though, like, if my phone were to be stolen, I think I would have a huge problem.
Why is that?
I don't know. I feel like there's so much on our phones nowadays.
Yeah.
Like everything, every password, every login to bank accounts.
I think phones these days are just a representation of yourselves in a much smaller form factor. You basically live your life on a phone. So
that's very poetic.
Very wise words.
Then that's it for this episode. Thank you very much for coming here and again for navigating this incredibly serious topic and for you to actually take the time to try to tackle this topic on a societal level. And so thank you very much for coming here. All the best for your conference presentation with this paper, and maybe see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. See you.